So the question is, where does education fit into humanitarian affairs or humanitarian responses? And I think the answer to that question requires us to look quite critically at what we mean by education. My feeling is that education can serve a number of very important functions in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. Once a certain modicum or degree of stability has been achieved. I think perhaps one of the most important functions education, without yet even considering the content of that education might play, is the stability that it brings to those within the context of displaced communities and populations. Secondly, I think it's quite important in terms of maintaining a sense of normalcy and routine within the schedule or routine of a displaced population. That is, it maintains not only a connection with a pre-displacement world or life, it also makes a connection to a post-displacement world. And thirdly, I think we have to look at education as part of an ongoing long-term investment in individuals, in children, in adults, so that they continue to cultivate the tools, the understandings, the skills, the values that will be required in a post-displacement world, and certainly give them the means to rebuild the worlds which had been challenged and destroyed, and ultimately that led to their displacement. When we turn our attention to the question of what type of education would be most appropriate or most needed within displaced communities, I think we have to think much more critically than the way we tend to in such contexts. I think there's a tendency, for a variety of reasons, for education to be treated as some type of product to be delivered to a displaced population. We have organizations that develop curricula that are intended for application almost regardless of what the context is. While this may have a role to play in terms of maintaining that sense of normalcy in displaced populations, my feeling is that we have to look much more seriously and systematically at other forms of education that may be readily available within IDP camps, within refugee camps. Such ideas perhaps challenge the top-down approaches to education in humanitarian emergencies. Nonetheless, I think that is an area that deserves much more attention. UNICEF Innocente, that is to say the UNICEF Research Center in Florence, approached me to edit a book. They had commissioned quite a number of research essays on the role of education in conflict zones around the world. The focus was very much on primary education and on children. It was an interesting request, so I reviewed the essays that had been prepared for UNICEF. The essays themselves were quite scattered in terms of the focus, in terms of their interests, in terms of the cases that they analyzed. And one thing that struck me from this collection of 20 or 30 essays was that there was no particular threads that tied them all together. So my response to UNICEF was that I would be happy to use this material as the basis for a monograph, but most of the essays themselves would take too much work in order to pull them together in an edited volume. Given that these essays had been sitting around on somebody's shelf for quite a while, they were pleased to let me get on with it. The result of that piece of research was the writing of The Two Faces of Education, a small monograph that was published and electronically available from about 2000 onwards. It was written, I went on to do different things, and I was quite surprised to find out years later that the monograph had in fact been taken up by quite a number of researchers and organizations, and was being used to structure their policies and programming related to education in conflict zones. I guess one of the things that strikes me about the experience of writing a monograph like this and having it taken up and used in different projects is the way in which there is a tendency to simply use what's there rather than to build on the arguments that were put forward over 14 years ago now. And it seems to me that the argument that education can have either a positive or negative impact on social development, on children in ethnicized conflicts, is fairly straightforward argument to make. The question is, where do we go from there? And I have to say that after 14 years and having seen special issues of journals come out on the Two Faces of Education, various research studies and theses written on using the Two Faces of Education, I still think that we haven't really taken that next step in our thinking about or our programming in this area of education for children in ethnic conflict.
Do you think since the Two Faces have come out, do you think, due to the recognition it's got and due to the amount of scholars that have based further work on it, do you think things have improved at all in terms of education in post-conflict environments?
That's a really tough one to answer. Partly because I haven't really been in the thick of it in terms of education policy. My feeling, though, and this is more of a gut feeling of the way in which the development industry works. My gut feeling is that to the extent that the ideas in the Two Faces of Education were taken aboard and operationalized in different programs, I believe the tendency would be to continue along the same lines of developing curricula on the outside and then bringing it in and delivering it, rather than the argument that's made in the latter portions of the monograph, which is peace building education is one that actually comes from the ground up. It's not parachuted in, and that idea, which on first glance looks fairly innocuous and unthreatening, does in fact pose challenges to the standard approaches to education. If we were to advocate for an education system that was bottom-up, that was organic, that drew on the cultural sensibilities of the communities where it was to be based, that immediately introduces the challenges of time. It's going to take a lot longer. It also introduces some difficulties in moving from that experience and that curriculum into other contexts, other linguistic and cultural contexts. Those factors, the increased amount of time, the difficulty in moving experiences and curriculum from one case to another, is something that doesn't work well within a development industry that moves according to standardized procedures, according to routine, and essentially according to principles of predictability and efficiency. So in some ways, the argument here for a peace-building education as opposed to a peace education, which focuses on bringing concepts of peace, fairly abstract concepts of peace, into a particular population, the idea of a peace-building, a genuine peace-building education is quite radical, and it challenges the principles and operating procedures of the development industry in this particular case.
Thank you. And while researching for the two faces, just in your opinion, how powerful do you think education is on conflict, both in the negative and positive sense? How powerful do you think it can be to be either instrumental to conflict or be used as a weapon during conflict? How strong do you think the connection is?
Yeah. The monograph provides a range of examples from a range of cases of the ways in which formal education can have profoundly negative or beneficial impacts in terms of social development, in terms of economic development, even in terms of political development. However, the focus, largely because of the nature of the essays and the research that this was drawing on, the focus tends to be on formal education as opposed to informal education.
Yeah.
So if we include both formal and informal education in our discussion, I think the same argument holds. It can be profoundly positive or profoundly negative. However, by expanding this kind of scope of our understanding of education, what that also means is that education starts at a very, very early stage. So when we talk about socialization of children, and some of the research that argues that children are influenced in terms of their attitudes, their values, their biases at a very early age. The consequence of which is that as they grow older, these early acquired biases become deeper and more entrenched. Yeah. So if we look at the informal mechanisms for education, whether it's attitudes towards women or homosexuals, then over time one would expect that to become, again, either very, very negative and corrosive, or in those rare cases where they're positive issues of tolerance and so on, then one would hope that they would get more deeply entrenched in a positive sense, but that's probably the exception.
So looking more in a humanitarian aspect, how much of a priority do you think education should have after a natural disaster or a conflict? Because obviously there are immediate concerns of water, etc., the practical things need to be done first, but how much of a priority do you think should be placed on education, especially when education may have been detrimental towards a conflict?
Yeah. I think it's important to point out that when this particular monograph was commissioned, the focus was not on humanitarian interventions per se or humanitarian crises. It was looking more at the way in which education has played a very negative role in the first phase in those cases of ethnicized violent conflict. Nonetheless, to answer your question, the tendency within the humanitarian industry is to look at those very immediate, almost physiological needs of the populations, the affected populations. And clearly, if those biological, physiological needs are not met in conditions of life and death, in extreme conditions, then those people, starting with the youngest and the weakest will start to die very quickly. However, there's a certain level at which a level of stability and equilibrium kicks in. And I think that that's a stage where the priority on education needs to be increased, both in terms of breaking patterns of dependency and, quite frankly, in very basic terms of humanity. Education provides something that is different from, but just as important as, the basic physiological requirements for existence. And I think perhaps that's the message regarding education in humanitarian disasters, that the human spirit, that knowledge, the connection to the ideas from the past are just as important as the physiological and biological needs.
I think one of the things I find it quite sad here is, as you said, that nobody actually picked this up as something, as a springboard to go beyond what you discuss here, and specifically looking at the parental education, parents educating their children about ethnic groups, like, being a single parent, allowing your child to mingle with Tamil kids and treating them as equal human beings doesn't necessarily being considered in education in emergencies or in general today. So
yeah, no, I think that when we do turn our attention to the question of education in humanitarian disasters, we're still very narrow in our understanding of education and in the range of examples that we use to illustrate our case. So as we were just saying, there's a tendency to look at displaced populations as passive objects in need of humanitarian assistance and our pity, as opposed to recognizing the diversity of skills that are there, the teachers, the engineers, the nurses, and the skill set that exists within these populations that in many ways becomes incapacitated through the humanitarian process. So those individuals who in a pre-displacement community or pre-displacement world were important members of that community, were contributing at a social, at an economic and political level, suddenly all of that gets erased by the juggernaut of humanitarian intervention. We see it, of course, when any of the individuals in the displaced populations speak the foreign language. They cease to be the doctors or the nurses or the engineers, and they become simply translators for this professionalized cadre of humanitarian actors, many of whom will have no background experience whatsoever in these areas, that are coming in to work with those who are actually the experts, or at least those who are knowledgeable, most knowledgeable in the field. But I think that's a function of the industry, and hopefully that's something that will be challenged through and by those who are taking the course, the MIHA course.
So what do you expect from people who actually use 2 phases of education as the foundation of their research or PhDs or
I think there's a lot more. I mean, the studies I've seen, the special issues of journals that I've seen that take the 2 phases of education, they use it in quite a mechanistic way. And they just say, here are the bad impacts, here are the good impacts, and here it is in Nepal, here it is in Sri Lanka, here it is in country X, Y, and Z. But what hasn't been done is a really systematic comparative study across cases, where we begin to better understand the different types of education systems. I mean, I've yet to see a good, solid study that compares the legacy of British colonial education systems French colonial education systems. I've yet to see a good critical comparative study of public versus private investment in education. I've yet to see a study that compares different types of conflicts and the post-conflict educational policies and structures that are developed. Those, to me, are the fairly obvious next steps from a study like this. That these don't seem to be happening, I think, is a really interesting question. It's an interesting question for the role of educational research in society. I think it's a really interesting question about the role of research more generally in terms of contributing to constructive social change. And to the extent that ideas, research, theories only reinforce the status quo, then they fail. And I suppose that means that, you know, to the extent that the potential of the two faces of education, you know, remain fairly limited, then I suppose I failed too. But by, you know, pushing the issue, by questioning where we go from here in our education research, you know, hopefully, finally, after all this time, we might be able to, you know, take that next step and, you know, have a much more kind of critical perspective and perhaps positive impact.
Could it be a reason that the researchers or practitioners of education are not humanitarian workers, or humanitarian workers are not necessarily the education researchers or practitioners? So there seems to be a disjuncture between the humanitarian community and the education community.
I think that what you're describing is the process of compartmentalization of expertise. And certainly our education system, whether it's here in the UK or whether it's in North America or elsewhere in Europe, there's a tendency towards hyper-compartmentalization. So that, yes, the humanitarians, which, you know, tend to come from a range of backgrounds, you know, are not as familiar with the educational theories and policies as they would otherwise be. But there's a reason for that. And again, the argument for maintaining that compartmentalization is efficiency. That it's more efficient to have your expert in water, your expert in public health, separate from those who are in education. But ultimately, when it comes to formulating responses that are effective as well as efficient, then that's where you have to begin to break down compartmentalization, or if that's not possible, at least have the right people at the table to discuss how to move forward. But typically in a humanitarian crisis, the absolute priority, understandably enough, is placed on speed. The need to get in there quickly and to respond. What's less appreciated is that the way in which we respond will have implications for subsequent access to certain groups, subsequent ways in which we can develop educational systems or health clinics and so on. And when we're not in a crisis or an emergency, that's the time to think about the way in which we respond to ensure that the space is still there for more effective use of education.
Because the reason is that, especially with the informal education, which is very close to public health approach to humanitarian issues, because you do educate your population on self-care, cleanliness, boiling water. So there is an education process actually going in, and as I said, like if they can combine that effort, like, so okay, you include the peace building concepts into that type of education, that can be useful, but unfortunately it doesn't necessarily look like nobody actually implement it in that way, because the agency that implement health doesn't do education, or the agencies that do education don't do health. So there is that disjuncture very much, and the compartmentalization.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I think one of the really interesting points of similarity between public health and education is that health is a public good. That is to say, if you eradicate a particular disease from a population, the entire population benefits. In the same way, if you introduce education into a publication, into the public, the whole public benefits. Now, I believe that. However, there are many economists and organizations, large multilateral organizations, who would argue that in fact, with the privatization of education, you have the opposite of a public good. Education becomes a private good. So individuals benefit from it, and to the extent that they do, then one can anticipate that there will be increased division within societies, where those who were able to avail themselves through one way or another of higher education will become separated from the bulk who did not. So I think looking at education as a public good is a very useful way to understand the broader societal benefits that one has from it.